I think the strange thing about friendships is that most of them don't actually end. At least not in the dramatic way people expect them to. There's usually no final argument, no moment where both people officially decide to stop being part of each other's lives, no clear emotional conclusion. Most friendships change quietly, so quietly that you don't even notice it happening at first. One day you're talking constantly, sending random videos, playing games late at night, laughing at things nobody else would understand. And then somehow, months later, you realize the conversations have become shorter, replies become slower, plans happen less often. The routine that once felt automatic slowly disappears. And the strange part is, nothing bad necessarily happened. Nobody betrayed anybody. Nobody suddenly became a terrible person. Life just kept moving. And I think that's what makes drifting friendships emotionally confusing. Because there's no obvious moment to grieve, no clear ending, just a gradual fading of presence. At first, your brain barely notices the change. You still assume we're good, because technically you still care about each other. But emotional closeness isn't only built on caring, it's built on consistency. And once consistency changes, the relationship starts feeling different in ways that are hard to explain properly. I remember there were people I used to talk to every single day, people who once knew almost everything about my life, and at the time I genuinely thought that level of closeness would last forever. Not because we made dramatic promises, but because when somebody becomes part of your daily life long enough, your mind quietly starts treating their presence as permanent. You assume there will always be another conversation tomorrow, another joke, another late night message, another moment where you both somehow end up talking for hours without planning to. And when you are still inside those moments, you never really imagine they could disappear quietly one day. But they do sometimes, not all at once, slowly. And I think adulthood changes friendships in ways nobody emotionally prepares you for. When you're younger, closeness happens naturally, school connects people automatically, free time connects people automatically. Shared routines keep friendships alive without much effort. But as people grow older, life becomes less synchronized. Schedules stop matching, responsibilities increase. People become emotionally tired in different ways. And sometimes even people who genuinely care about each other slowly become less present in each other's lives. I think that realization hurts because your memories still remember the older version of the connection. Your mind still remembers when everything felt easy, when conversations felt automatic instead of intentional, when emotional closeness didn't require planning, and part of you keeps expecting that version of the friendship to return, even while reality is slowly changing. That's why nostalgia can feel so heavy sometimes, because you don't only miss the person, you miss the emotional atmosphere that existed around them, the familiarity, the comfort, the version of yourself that existed naturally around those conversations. And sometimes that's the hardest part, realizing that certain versions of your life quietly disappear while you're still busy living them. I think what makes it even harder is that most drifting friendships don't come with closure. There's no final conversation that clearly explains everything. No moment where someone says, "This friendship is ending now." Instead, you're left trying to emotionally interpret silence. And silence can mean so many different things. Sometimes people are busy, sometimes they're overwhelmed, sometimes they're changing privately in ways they don't know how to explain. But when someone used to be part of your everyday life, even small changes feel noticeable. A delayed reply suddenly feels heavier than it should. A shorter conversation feels strangely unfamiliar. And eventually you start wondering if the connection is fading even before you fully want to admit it. I think that's the part people rarely talk about, honestly. The slow uncertainty of not knowing whether a friendship is simply changing or quietly disappearing. Because when relationships fade gradually, there's no obvious emotional moment to react to. You can't point at one specific event and say, that's when everything changed. It's usually much quieter than that. You just wake up one day and realize you no longer know what's happening in each other's lives anymore. And that realization feels strange when somebody once felt emotionally close enough to tell everything to. I remember realizing this with certain people I cared about deeply. At first, I kept assuming things would eventually return to normal, that maybe everyone was just temporarily busy, temporarily tired, temporarily distracted by life. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes life changes people gradually without either person fully noticing it while it's happening. Priorities shift, routines change, energy becomes limited, and eventually the friendship starts surviving more on memory than on actual presence. I think that's why certain friendships feel impossible to replace. Because they weren't built only on conversation, they were built on shared time, specific eras of life, specific habits, specific emotional versions of each other. And once those periods disappear, recreating that exact closeness becomes difficult. Not because anybody failed, but because people keep evolving. And honestly, I think one of the saddest parts of growing older is realizing that some people who once felt permanent slowly become memories you revisit privately. Not enemies, not strangers completely, just people connected to another chapter of your life. And maybe that's why certain songs hurt unexpectedly, or certain games feel nostalgic in ways you can't fully explain. Because sometimes memories don't just remind you of people, they remind you of who you used to be around them. When friendship starts feeling different, you stop telling each other every small detail about your day. It just happens naturally over time and you won't even notice it. That's when the distance starts feeling real. Not when communication completely stops, but when the emotional rhythm changes. Because there's a difference between talking to someone and feeling emotionally involved in each other's lives. You can still message somebody occasionally while quietly realizing you no longer know what they're truly going through anymore. And that realization feels strange when someone once felt emotionally close enough to understand without explanation. I think people assume friendships only become painful when they end completely. But honestly, sometimes the hardest stage is the transition period, when things are still technically okay, but no longer emotionally familiar. Because part of you keeps comparing the present version of the friendship to the older one, the easier one, the more natural one, and without meaning to, you start noticing the contrast constantly. Conversations that once lasted hours now end after a few minutes. Plans become harder to make happen. Silences become more common. And eventually you start wondering whether you're both holding on to the memory of the friendship more than the current version of it. That thought hurts quietly, because nobody wants to admit when closeness starts fading, especially when there's still love there. I think that's why some friendships feel emotionally confusing for so long. The care doesn't disappear immediately, but the connection changes shape faster than your emotions can fully process. And sometimes both people notice it at the same time without knowing how to talk about it. So instead, everyone acts normal, even while privately feeling the distance growing little by little. And honestly, I think adulthood contains a lot of silent grieving like that. Not dramatic loss, just subtle emotional changes nobody prepared you for. The realization that some people who once felt permanently connected to your daily life slowly become occasional conversations, and maybe nobody is truly at fault for that. Maybe life simply moves people into different emotional directions sometimes. Still, I think part of us will always miss when friendship felt effortless. As I got older, I started understanding something that was difficult for me to accept before. A lot of people are more overwhelmed than they let others see. When you're younger, it's easy to assume distance means disinterest. If someone stops reaching out, your mind immediately searches for emotional explanations. Maybe they stopped caring. Maybe the bond mattered more to you than it did to them. Maybe you became forgettable somehow. But life becomes heavier for people in ways that aren't always visible. Some are trying to survive exhausting routines. Some are mentally drained every day. Some are struggling privately while still pretending everything is fine in public. And I think adulthood teaches people how to hide exhaustion very well. That realization changed how I viewed certain friendships, because I started noticing that silence isn't always rejection. Sometimes silence is burnout. Sometimes it's emotional fatigue. Sometimes somebody is so consumed by their own problems that maintaining connection starts slipping unintentionally. And the difficult part is that two people can care about each other sincerely while still failing to stay consistently present in each other's lives. That used to confuse me. I thought genuine connection was supposed to naturally survive everything. But now I think relationships require more than care alone. They require energy, time, attention, mental space, and those things become harder to maintain as life grows more complicated. I remember realizing this during periods where even replying to messages started feeling mentally delayed for me. Not because I disliked anyone, not because I wanted distance. I was just tired in a way that made social energy feel heavier than usual. And suddenly, I understood how easy it is for people to unintentionally drift while still caring deeply. That realization made me softer towards certain memories, because instead of seeing every fading friendship as abandonment, I started seeing how human limitation affects connection too. People get overwhelmed, people lose balance, people disappear into responsibilities for a while, and unfortunately, relationships can weaken quietly during those periods, not through cruelty, just through absence repeated too many times. I think that's why adulthood can feel lonelier than people expect. Not because meaningful connections stop existing, but because maintaining closeness becomes harder than it used to be. Everyone is carrying invisible weight. Everyone is trying to manage their own stress, fears, responsibilities, and exhaustion at the same time. And sometimes, even good people unintentionally become distant while trying to survive their own lives. That realization doesn't completely remove the sadness, but it does make the sadness feel less personal. Because maybe not every disappearing connection was proof that you weren't important. Maybe some people were simply struggling in ways you couldn't fully see from the outside. You remember certain people, and suddenly your mind places you back into moments that don't exist anymore. Old conversations, old routines, old versions of yourself that only existed in that specific environment. And for a few seconds, it feels almost like you could step back into it. But reality doesn't follow memory like that. What used to feel automatic now requires effort. What once happened naturally now feels distant and unfamiliar. And I think that shift is where a lot of emotional confusion comes from. Because nothing ended in a clear way. It just stopped continuing in the same shape. At first, I used to interpret that as something missing or unfinished. Like there was still a way to restore what existed before if I just tried hard enough. But over time, I started noticing something important. The conditions that created those friendships no longer exist in the same form. Different schedules, different priorities, different mental space, different versions of who we've become. So even if two people still care about each other, the connection can't always stay identical. And that doesn't mean it was fake or temporary in a meaningless way. It just means it belonged to a specific time in life. There's a difference between something being gone and something simply no longer fitting where life is now. And I think that distinction matters more than people realize. Because when you stop forcing old emotional patterns into your current life, something quieter starts happening. You begin to appreciate what those moments were without needing them to return exactly as they were. You stop treating memory like something incomplete and start seeing it as something that already had its full value when it existed. What changed for me was understanding that remembering doesn't have to mean reopening. You can acknowledge that someone shaped a part of your life without needing them to still be actively present in it for that impact to remain real. And strangely enough, that realization made certain memories feel less painful over time. Not because they became less meaningful, but because I stopped demanding them to behave like they were still ongoing. Some experiences are meant to stay where they happened, not because they're finished in a negative way, but because they already did what they were supposed to do in your life at that time. And once you understand that, nostalgia starts to feel less like loss and more like recognition. What stays, even after everything changes, eventually, you stop measuring friendships by how closely they match what they used to be. Because no matter how much time passes, some people don't really leave you in the way distance suggests. They just stop being part of your everyday routine. And that's different. There are connections that quietly shift into the background of your life, but never fully disappear from your memory. You just learn to carry them differently. Not as something you're actively holding on to, but as something that already became part of your history. And I think that's where a more peaceful understanding starts to form. You begin to see that not every change is a loss, in the way you first assume it is. Sometimes it's just life moving people into different directions without any single moment of conflict or failure. People grow, circumstances shift, attention gets divided, and somehow, without anyone intending it, distance becomes normal. What surprised me most was realizing that this doesn't always mean the connection was weak. In some cases, it only means it belonged to a certain chapter of your life that naturally closed, as everything else changed around it. And when you look back at those moments, they don't feel empty, they feel complete in their own way, even if they're no longer active in your present life. Because they shaped how you experienced a part of your life that you'll never revisit in the same form again. I used to think closure had to come from conversation, from explanation, from understanding every detail of why things changed. But over time, I realized most of it doesn't arrive like that. It comes from acceptance that doesn't need full answers to settle, from understanding that some people were important in a specific season, and that's enough to make it meaningful. And once that settles in, you stop forcing emotional rewrites of the past. You stop trying to turn memories into something they aren't anymore. You just let them exist as they are, not as something lost, not as something broken, but as something that happened, influenced you, and stayed with you in a quieter form. And maybe that's what growing up really feels like. Not forgetting people, not erasing moments, but learning how to let them remain in the past without needing them to stay alive in the present to still matter. Because some connections don't end in a way you can clearly point to. They just settle into memory and stay there. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If this video resonated with you in any way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps support the growth of this content and allows me to keep making more videos like this. Goodbye, and take care.